Good morning, Urban Faith. We are here again. It is such a pleasure to be with you and to share with you today. We have another amazing author and her work to share. We are with Chanel Dokun, and she is sharing her book, Life Starts Now. You can get this book. It's coming out actually this week. So make sure that you look for it, look out for it. And what she's really talking about is how for women in particular, but everybody in general, has this opportunity to start life today, that we don't have to live externally and get caught up in defining ourselves by things that are outside of us, but we can find our value and worth on the inside. So I'm so glad to be with Chanel today. Thank you so much for sharing with Urban Faith, Chanel.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. I'm so excited for you all to get your hands on the book and get a hold of this content, really.
Absolutely. And so my first question is, I'm just being able to read through this book. I know that it can be a lot to try to process all these ideas and find inspiration and get through. What inspired you to write a book like this that I think is really timely for a lot of women and a lot of people in general?
Yeah, I have the pleasure of working as a life planner, working as a therapist. I spend a lot of time with women helping them figure out those core questions of life. Why do I exist? Where am I headed? What's the point of it all? And one of the things that was so surprising to me is having all of these women that I admire and I think have something beautiful and incredible inside of them. They have big ambitions to do things in the world, and yet they feel like internally they're drowning and they feel like their life has no meaning. And so I was happy to be able to work with them one on one and take them through a process where we can start to unpack their lives, start to give them some language to understand who they are. And I thought, well, what would it look like to actually take this content out into a larger space where more women, more people in general could have access to it so they could start to process through some of these questions for themselves,
Hmm.
feel a little bit like they're unleashed to start living the life that they want.
Absolutely. And you talk about some of those questions, and I see the way that you set up even working through your book. They're so practical. Why was it important to try to deal with some of these really big questions in a really practical way for you?
Yeah, great question. I feel like sometimes when we're talking about things like, the purpose of life, our existence,
Right.
right? We start to get weird. Like we all get weird about it and we start using language that, we would never actually use. And it becomes something that sits as like head knowledge, right? And it doesn't actually inform our day-to-day experience. And I think that the reality of the answer to those questions is how you start living tomorrow. And
Mm.
so I wanted it to be super practical where all of these things that you can discover about yourself, we get a lot of this in the self-help space, a lot of self-discovery, a lot of personal growth. But I wanted people to have an immediate way that they could start to apply that and say, this informs how I show up in relationship tomorrow. This is how I will walk into my office tomorrow and what I might say when I'm sitting at a conference table with someone else. And so it was important to me that it wasn't just head knowledge or more kind of insight, but it actually moved into the space where it could be in your hands and feet and you can start to live differently.
Right. And I think that that's so important, especially for us. We're talking to believers, we're talking to young women, and a lot of times we can get advice that doesn't really touch us where we are,
Yeah.
and doesn't acknowledge and deal with the fact that this is hard work. And I think that you do a good job of naming that, and you do it with such humor and such candor. One of the questions that came to me as I'm going through this is, why is it important for us to make this shift in our worth from seeing ourselves as defined by what we have or who we're with or what it is that we do? You name that specifically,
Yeah.
into finding our worth in other spaces. Why is it important for us to make that shift?
Yeah, we have such little control over all of those other spaces, right? And so I think we become limited in our ability to experience deep satisfaction and to actually pursue things that are meaningful to us
Mm,
when we're kind of being, I call it being externally formed, right? When we're going after, a job that's supposed to define who I am, or a particular relationship that shapes what I should want or what I want to accomplish in my life, or I'm trying to acquire a bunch of, objects or possessions in my life that are somehow supposed to be meaningful to me. And when we start to live in that externally formed way, I think what ends up happening is we end up building a life that from the outside looks really successful,
mhm,
and inside feels deeply meaningless. Right? Because we haven't been certain that we've actually tapped into the core things that matter to us, to how God has uniquely created you, right?
mm.
The life that is a meaningful, successful, thriving life for you is a life that's very different than the life that I have been created to live. And so we want to make sure we don't waste our lives
Mm,
um, like succeeding at the wrong things.
yeah. And I think that you name a few times ways that people do that. They waste their lives trying to succeed at the wrong things. But you do the work of showing us, okay, so now that we've got that out of the way and we've spent time thinking through that, what are some of the right things? How can we begin to find what are those things that should drive us, those things that come from the inside? What are some of the ways? Give me one way, because you explore them in your book. What is one of the ways we can begin to find that thing or to help find ourselves in self-worth?
Yeah. The number one thing I recommend people start with is to tackle, I think, the biggest barrier to us hearing our own voice, which is we spend a lot of our life internalizing other voices, and we spend a lot of our life paying attention to what culture or other people are telling us. And so, any effort that you can make to get quiet and to silence those voices and actually tap into your own voice and start to pay attention to what your deepest longings are, when you start to notice yourself and pay attention to what do I actually do well, what actually gets me excited, that kind of regular routine practice of silencing the world around you and amplifying your own voice, that's really the place to start. I have a practice I call like my reclaim the morning practice.
Mm,
Really, it's saying every day, I like to start my day with my voice being like the first voice that's telling me this is who you are and what you want. So
wow.
before anybody else defines me, I get to define myself for the world, of course, informed by who God says I am, right? That's part of it. But I remind myself of that narrative, and then I can live from that place the whole day. So that would be my invitation to, the folks watching, is to make sure that you have some sort of practice in your life where you tune other things out and you give space just to hear yourself think.
Yeah. One of the other things that you name that I've talked about a few times is that it's okay for you not to be extraordinary. Right.
Yes.
That there's pressure and a falseness in trying to everybody has to be a unicorn, right? And if my rainbow is the biggest, then I won. Um, tell me why it is that talk a little bit more about that. I just want to hear your thoughts there because I thought that that was so important to lift up. Why is it okay to it's a good thing to be ordinary?
Yeah, I love this idea of a big rainbow, though. I have to like log that away. It's like I want the biggest rainbow because there's a part of me that secretly wants that. Um, no, I think that there is so much pressure to be extraordinary. And the funny thing is, extraordinary actually only looks one way, right? Like when we think about it, like for our culture, it's, extraordinary is like being Beyonce. It's like I have to fit into that mold or it's not okay. And I think that we miss out on like the amazing, incredible things that God has created all of us to do uniquely when we're pursuing one version of success, when we're pursuing one version of extraordinary. And it's actually this space where I find that the ordinary is pretty extraordinary. Like I
Mm,
sit with women, and when I get them to unpack their lives and start talking about what they do well or the burden that they carry for certain parts of the world, and I'm like, you care about that? Like, thank God that you care about that. Thank God that
Mm,
you exist and you have that particular wiring that has equipped you to be able to handle tackling that problem that we all are experiencing. I know I don't care about it to the degree that you do. And so I'm so grateful that you exist. And so I think that the whole culture suffers when we all seek to be unicorns. We
mhm.
can't just have a bunch of unicorns. We need to have actually some horses. We need some donkeys
Yeah.
out here doing other things too, because we all, bring something to bear to the world around us.
I think that that's so true. And I've got 3 daughters, right? I'm gonna own up to that. So I'm living in the world where this book is speaking to them. My oldest is 12, so she's like just entering the space where this will be super valuable to her. I wonder what sort of advice would you give to young women who are trying to figure out how to define themselves? And certainly it applies to all people, so please go there. But I'm thinking about my daughters and saying, get all the wisdom that you can. What sort of advice would you give them to help, you know, help find themselves and be okay in their ordinary, and that is extraordinary.
Yeah, I think to remember that you give shape to the world and to the water, like no matter who you are and what you do, you don't have to look any particular way. I think that for a lot of young folks, what they do is they try to look outside of themselves and say, what's the pathway to being accepted? What's the pathway to being successful? I want to make a splash. I want to have an impact in the world. And so they try to replicate what someone else has done. And they spend a lot of time kind of splashing around, I say, in that kind of water of culture, trying to make some sort of impact. And I think the interesting thing that I've noticed is that when you stop trying to manufacture a different way of being and you actually sit more in that kind of personal space and start to own, like, well, how have I been created? What skills do I have? Like, what talents do I have that have sat here that God's kind of deposited in my life? What particular passions and heart do I have? And also, how have I been uniquely placed? Like, God put me in a particular context and I've been positioned to be able to be successful with what I have.
Mm.
If I can focus my energy and attention on that space, I'm actually more likely to have impact than trying to move out of the context where I've been placed to be successful and trying to like take on somebody else's journey. So I think, especially at 12, oh my goodness, I think about your little girl and I think, wow, that is that time where you're in this space where you're really trying to figure out, how do I align with a group, right?
Yeah,
Like, how do I
right.
figure out my identity in the context of this larger group? And you think the path is, I need to conform, I need to like play the role, be the part that everybody else is playing right now. And I would just encourage her, like, no, like, God made you different because he knew specifically that you would be successful if you lived out the way that he made you to be. And he put you in a place where you can thrive. And so just own that and kind of rest in it rather than trying to fight against it.
That's so good. I think that one of the other questions that I have, and it really applies no matter what your age, and I tend to ask this because I think it's important, and you name it, is finding people who are role models and mentors.
Mhm.
And you talk about your mom, number 2, you talk about the women in your life who have helped form and shape you. Why is that mentorship or that role modeling important as we go along in our journeys to really discover what God put in us and then let that come out into the world?
Yeah, I think it's helpful to know that we're not alone. I think so much of our experience, it feels like we're the first one to ever have like walked this path. And I think we can put so much pressure on ourselves to come up with new solutions for how to live. And it's so great to be able to benefit from the lessons that other people have lived. And so I think, my mom, number 2, I think about my mentor, Michelle Burford, who's a writer. She's amazing. They have already gone through those trials, and I can actually benefit and fast track my journey by, gleaning from what they've gone through. And so I think having that person who can, who's kind of been on the path a little bit farther ahead of you, and can tell you what's coming up and can kind of call you on your ego and
Yeah.
some of that too. That can be really, really valuable. But more than anything, I think just to normalize the experience. When I'm working with clients, I think the number one question they're asking is like, am I crazy? Right?
Mhm.
That's what kind of, they're like, is there something wrong with me?
Yeah.
And I think mentors and role models do such an excellent job of helping us go like, you're not crazy. It totally makes sense that you'd feel that way. And it's okay. You'll get through it. And that, I think that really encourages us to keep walking.
That's so important. And I think I'll ask you two more questions. But
Sure.
my second to last one, of course, in our audience, we always want to talk about relationships and dating and all of that. And I think that your perspective on it, at being able to own and be in that space without it defining you, is so important. Can you talk a little bit about that? Uh, how do we have our relationships and have them be life-giving and invest in them without them defining us, as so many people get caught up in?
Yeah, I always say that there's this little verse in what is it, Jeremiah 29:11, that says like God knows the plans and purposes for our life. And so many of my clients kind of exist like there's a little asterisk there that says like, but you must have like a husband, or you must have like a partner in
Mm,
order for that to be true. And I think just to be reminded that individually you've been created with a plan and a purpose, right? That there
mm,
are no qualifications for God's like intentions for your life. There's no prerequisite for his love for you, right?
mm,
And so I think to be able to continue to pursue the life that you are desiring and the one that you feel called to, regardless of what your relational state is. I also think that as you start to define your purpose, it's a lot easier to find the right partner,
mm,
right? Because when you're running, you're able to look to your left and right and say, well, who's running with me? Who's kind of walking the life that is actually most fulfilling for me?
mhm,
Rather than me ending up with a partner that might actually be somebody that takes me away from the things that I most desire. So
mm,
I think it's really critical that we actually start at the place of knowing ourselves, knowing what we need, and knowing what God is uniquely calling us to, and then looking for partners that can be supportive of that, who can benefit from our talents, right?
mhm.
And who can also fuel our talents as well.
That's so important, that iron sharpens iron, right? I guess is a really good way to think about that. And at the core of everything that you're doing and talking about is this faith component that I really want to be able to tease out here.
Mhm.
Can you talk a little bit about why faith is at the center of this journey, right? You kind of alluded to it, and it's weaved in through how you're thinking in the midst of this book. Why is faith at the center of this journey that you're taking us on and helping us through?
Yeah, I think faith is most critical because we have to trust that there's someone that knows more than us. We have to trust that God is actually the author and perfecter, and not only of our faith, but of our lives, of who we are,
Mm,
right? And that his vision for who we are meant to be is actually the best one. And I think that that core moment where we actually submit our lives to his vision of our thriving, is the moment when things start to shift. Where I feel like, our kind of self-help industry and a lot of, the folks that are in the space that I play in often with therapy, and with this life planning work, where they get lost is and they take on the burden of trying to manufacture and construct their lives for themselves.
mhm,
So they start with just, kind of these arbitrary ideas of what thriving means, and then they try to, grin and bear it and just muscle through to make it happen out of their own power. And often they end up pursuing things that aren't really meant for them.
mm.
And so I think that it's important for us to actually keep God in mind as like that's the starting point.
Yeah.
It's recognizing, I often say with life planning, it's not a creation experience, it's really a discovery process. It's knowing that God has already deposited these things in my life. he, before I was born, he'd already knit me together, and he already had some thoughts about who I could be, and what was possible for me, and what would bring me joy, and what would actually best utilize my life, right, for me to make an impact with the world around me. And so if we trust that, we can have a lot more fun with it.
Mm,
We can actually like let go and just play. We can say like, we can actually approach the whole process with wonder and just say like, God, what have you done here? Because I can trust that you're in control. I can trust that your vision for my life and for the world around me is good. So if those are fundamental things that are true, like this whole self-discovery process is just one that, you know, it's a playground. It doesn't have to be a pressured experience.
I love that analogy of having our lives be more playful. I think that that wonder is so missing, especially in conversation about purpose. It's like purpose, I must do it, otherwise, the world's gonna fall apart.
Right.
And to think about it, us living life and enjoying life with God, and I like that a lot. I appreciate that. So, any final thoughts for you from our audience, or for our audience of young people, of, folks in general? What do you want to leave us with from Life Starts Now?
Yeah, I think just really that life starts now. Do it today, right? I encourage you to, if you have been asking questions about like, who am I? What am I meant to do in the world? I really encourage you to get those answers now. Like, this is actually stuff that's knowable. I think
Mm.
it can feel very elusive and confusing. But head out, grab the book, and actually sit through this content and work through it. Actually play through it and get to discover some things about yourself, because I do really believe that you can get answers to these questions and actually start living different tomorrow. So do it now.
Absolutely. So this has been fantastic to hear about this. This book, Life Starts Now, is available. I think that you're addressing some of the biggest questions, some of the most important ones I hear about all the time from our audience. Purpose, relationships. How do I live out my faith in practical ways? And you're doing it all, and you've given it to us so that we can start now. And so thank you so much for being with us, Chanel. I appreciate this book. Like I said, this is one that I want for my daughters. And
Aw.
this is one that I want, even my wife, is thinking about these things for me, right? Like men too. This is for you because we need this. We need to be able to start living instead of watching from the sidelines or watching someone else's life. Like that's me, and really letting ourselves be ourselves.
Yes, I love it.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. Your book, Life Starts Now, is available everywhere this week. Check it out. Thank you so much, Urban Faith, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you, Chanel.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.